The first thing that's probably going through your head right now is, Andy, why are you trying to answer such an extremely specific question and what in the hell am I looking at? First off, the title of the video isn't the actual question I was concerned with. The question I was actually trying to answer was, can you beat a level 100 wild Hoppip that retains the moves it would normally have when encountered at its intended level before the trainer Joey battle with a level 5 starter Pokemon obtained from Professor Elm that has not won a single battle in Pokemon Crystal? That's far too much to put in a YouTube title, so throughout this video I'll be using an abbreviated version of that question. You're still probably wondering, why the hell would I care? Well, I was attempting to complete a Pokemon Crystal challenge run in which every Pokemon, wild or owned by a trainer, was level 100, except my own. Additionally, any Pokemon I caught would be reduced to level 1, so I couldn't just catch a whole team of level 100s and blast through the game. Therefore, I needed to level up my Pokemon somehow, and in the beginning of the game, battling wild Pokemon was the only feasible option. Okay, but why Hoppip? Let me take you through the beginning of the game to explain why I chose this adorable little shit as my arch nemesis. But first, a huge shout out to one of my viewers, Brad, who made this ROM hack. Without him, I would have never been able to even attempt this run. Pokemon Crystal starts out like most Pokemon games. You choose a starter Pokemon, and then you're sent on a fetch quest for the professor, all the while encountering wild Pokemon on the way. I chose Totodile as my starter because it has a higher attack stat than Cyndaquil and Chikorita, which is all that matters for the very beginning of the run because none of the starters have a move that relies on special attack when they are first given to the player. Additionally, my Pokemon's HP, defense, and speed don't matter right now since everything in the first area outspeeds me and any damaging move will one-shot me. I headed out with my new Totodile to pick up an egg from Mr. Pokemon, save scumming every single encounter on my way since the chance of me successfully running away from these beasts was pretty low. I got the mystery egg without too much trouble and death warped back to the Pokemon Center in Cherry Grove. Soon after, I was ambushed by my edgy rival, but thankfully I don't have to win this battle to progress. He annihilated my Totodile, stole my lunch money, and then foolishly told me he's gamertag, which I then reported to the bully hunter back at the lab. After that, I completed the fetch quest and was now able to start the game for real. At this point in the run, my world was limited to New Barktown, Cherry Grove City, and routes 29, 30, and 46. The reason I couldn't progress any further was that youngster Joey blocks off any progression until he is beaten, and his level 100 Rattata is significantly more powerful than the wild Pokemon because he has a higher tier AI. Generally, wild Pokemon have the lowest tier AI, in which each move has an equal chance of being selected. In Joey's case, he's far more likely to use Tackle than Tail Whip and obliterates any unleveled Pokemon I can catch at this point without even giving me a chance. Professor Elm's assistant did give me 5 Pokeballs, but even though there was a decent variety of Pokemon I could catch in the first area, none of them would have any moves like Sand Attack or Endeavor that I could exploit because in this version of the hack, the wild Pokemon have movesets matching their original levels. For example, a Pidgey that was originally level 4 will only have Tackle despite now being level 100. Also, since all of the Pokemon I'd catch would be reduced to level 1, I wasn't too concerned with catching Pokemon right now since they wouldn't be stronger than my level 5 Totodile. So I began to brainstorm some strategies. One option was to exploit the wild Pokemon AI and use save states to ensure that they would only use non-damaging moves or missed with a move that didn't have an accuracy of 100. The main problem with this strategy is that, as many of you know, Pokemon can only use their moves a certain amount of times, and once they've used all their moves, they'll use Struggle, which will knock out my Pokemon without fail. Based on that reasoning, I would not only have to survive all of the moves a Pokemon can throw at me, but also defeat them before they use Struggle, which is an issue when most of the time I could only do around 2 damage. To further complicate things, my Pokemon also have a limited number of moves, meaning that if I only used Totodile, I would only have 35 scratch attacks to defeat the wild Pokemon or it would be over. And no, I can't just fight a Metapod or a Kakuna. They aren't in any of the areas I can access right now in Crystal version, and even if I could, their defense is way too high, especially after using Harden, so I wouldn't be able to take them out before they OHKO me with Struggle. Although there's probably a scenario with a specific Pokemon that I could beat by using the aforementioned exploit, I came up with what I thought was a better and less scummy method. In routes 29 and 30, Hoppips have a 5% chance of spawning during the morning and daytime. In Pokemon Crystal, their movesets were changed from Gold and Silver to learn Synthesis at level 5 instead of level 1, and because these Hoppips were originally level 3 or 4, the only move they have in this hack is Splash, a non-damaging move with 40 PP. Furthermore, Hoppip, in comparison to the other Pokemon I could encounter, has a relatively low HP and defense, so it became the prime candidate to pummel into the ground. Unfortunately, it wasn't that simple. In Pokemon Crystal, there are 4 components that determine a Pokemon's stats: base stats, individual values, stat experience, and stage multipliers. Base stats are determined by the Pokemon species, so that all Pokemon of that species have the same base stats. Individual values, also known as IVs, are randomly generated integers between 0 and 15 inclusive that influence each base stat, the higher the better. Stat experience, a mechanic very similar to effort values or EVs in the succeeding generations, is awarded after victories and further increases the stats of Pokemon. Stat experience does not influence a wild Pokemon's stats, and since I would only receive stat experience after defeating a Pokemon, it's not going to matter in this strategy since the whole point is to win the first battle. Finally, stage multipliers come into play during battles when a Pokemon uses an attack that raises or lowers a stat for the duration of the battle. Totodile starts out with Leer, which lowers the opponent's physical defense, and since Scratch is a physical type move, it would definitely be helpful. Based on this information, I would want to pit the highest attack Totodile against the weakest possible Hoppip. I went to Pokemon Showdown's damage calculator and found that with a max attack IV of 15, a level 5 Totodile would have an attack stat of 15. Looking at Bulbapedia, the lowest HP and defense stats for Hoppip are 180 and 76 respectively. I set up the best case stats scenario in the calculator, used Leer 6 times to lower Hoppip's defense to the minimum, and looked to see how much damage a critical hit of Scratch would do. The damage calculation for an attack includes an element of randomness, and in Generation 2, this leads to 39 separate values. The highest value, which in this setup is 6, is what I call a perfect critical hit. Assuming I use Leer 6 times, that gives me 34 turns to attack, since on the 41st turn, Hoppip will run out of PP for Splash and outspeed me with Struggle, forfeiting my attack for that turn. Even if I backed off on the Leers, I would only have one more Scratch available before I ran out of PP. Anyway, if I got a perfect critical hit with Scratch all 34 turns, I would be able to inflict 204 damage based on the damage calculator, which is more than enough to take down a minimum HP Hoppip. So it is theoretically possible to defeat a level 100 Hoppip with a level 5 Totodile. However, if you've watched my previous content, you probably checked how much time was remaining in the video and knew there had to be some fuckery afoot. After around 20 hours of research into this theory with numerous hiccups, I was excited to finally test this strategy out. My first goal was to get the highest attack Totodile possible from Professor Elm. I made a save state and reloaded for upwards of a half hour trying to get an attack stat of 15. In that time, I was only able to achieve an attack of 13, but I wanted to do some other testing, so I just went with it. Now it was time to find a Hoppip that had a low enough HP and defense for me to take down. This is where the run got difficult. Well, not difficult, I just had to be extremely lucky. There was only a 5% chance to even encounter a Hoppip, and I had no way of knowing what the Hoppip's stats were when I eventually did find one. I could just get to the end of the 40 turns and whoops, it's the wrong one, try again you fucking wingnut. Even worse, I couldn't just turbo through all of these turns in a single second since I had to make sure that Totodile got a critical hit on every turn. Even or worser, there's no easy way to know when Totodile lands a perfect critical hit, which, mind you, has about a 0.16% chance of occurring. Does that sound bad? You don't even f***ing know. Even if I was lucky enough to run into the weakest Hoppip, which is a 1 in 128 chance itself, I would need at least 10 out of the 34 criticals to be perfect criticals. The chance of this occurring is 1 in 10. With that kind of probability, the heat death of the universe would defeat Hoppip before I would. However, not all is lost. That probability is for the perfect scenario, but I knew there were many different combinations of perfect criticals and low Hoppip stats that could lead to victory. Of course, with a chance as low as that, trying to win without turboing and using save states is out of the question. Although it would only take me around 7,000 tries. Being able to save after a successful perfect critical hit would cut the average time down to something that could actually be done by a mortal. That is, if there wasn't still one overwhelming problem. At this point, I still had no way of knowing when Totodile landed a perfect critical hit. If I could get around that, then I think it would only take a couple days for me to beat a Hoppip. The opponent's HP is not numerically shown, so what I did was create an overlay that made each of the 48 pixels in the Hoppip's health bar identifiable. My plan was to find out in which situations the bar would be lowered by 1 or more pixels. I would then correspond the number of pixels to different percentage values of total health associated with different Hoppip stats in order to determine when perfect critical values were inflicted, as well as whether or not the Hoppip was weak enough. I started to get my Excel sheet ready when I realized something was bothering me. Why wasn't I able to get the max 15 attack stat Totodile in my previous testing? I was pretty sure it would be at minimum a 1 in 16 chance of occurring, but I definitely tried way more than 16 times. I reviewed some of my research and remembered something that should have been way more alarming when it first occurred. In the Pokemon Showdown damage calculator, I was unable to get Hoppip's HP and defense values to go down to the minimums reported by Bulbapedia without changing the base stats. I knew the issue wasn't that natures weren't being accounted for, as they didn't exist in Generation 2 and the calculator didn't give the option to add them. Just what in the hell was going on here? Did the calculator not work? Was Bulbapedia wrong? Did my ROM hack have a malfunction? I was starting to lose it and decided to just work out the formulas on my own. After calculating the attack statistics myself, I found out the reason I couldn't get the reported stats from Bulbapedia was because the Pokemon Showdown damage calculator assumes that both Pokemon have maximum stat experience, and you aren't given the option to modify this. You can in the other generation tabs, but not in the Generation 2 calculator. In my scenarios, these values were supposed to be minimum. They betrayed me, they didn't keep their promise, they tricked me, and now I wasted 20 hours of my life pursuing a goal of now questionable possibility due to incorrect calculations that weren't even my fault. I used my newfound rage to stimulate what dwindling motivation I had left for this project and pushed onward, throwing out the damage calculator and creating my own behemoth of an equation. Drawing on information from Bulbapedia, this mathematical atrocity is the definitive answer to whether or not it is possible to beat a level 100 Hoppip with a level 5 Totodile. The equation was so large that I had to use 2 pieces of paper side by side when writing it out, and it is the largest equation I have ever written in my life. On the top, we have the damage calculation over the entire battle, and on the bottom, we have the Hoppip HP calculation. If the top result is greater than or equal to the bottom result, then Totodile successfully defeats the Hoppip and is rewarded with glorious experience, making the next Hoppip battle considerably easier. You're probably wondering if the damage calculation is really this complex. Yeah, basically. What makes it a little more complicated than your average damage calculation is that it takes into account all of the possibilities for several different variables. Namely, the stats of both Pokemon, the 7 different defense stage modifiers that can occur in the battle, and the total number of turns available. Now, if you're a casual and don't want to hear the full detailed explanation of how this equation is built, you can cheese this video by skipping to the timestamp on the screen. I'll give you a few seconds. Okay, now that we've culled the weak, let's build this equation up from the start. Quick note, a lot of this equation can be easily simplified from the start, but it's important to keep all of these parts unsimplified to aid in explanation and gloating purposes. Don't worry, we'll simplify this at the end. As I said before, there are 2 main components, the total damage calculation and the Hoppip HP calculation. The damage calculation contains 2 statistic calculations, one for Totodile's attack and one for Hoppip's defense, both of which I've modified to represent all the possible values based on different IVs. I'm going to keep the vanilla formulas off to the side to aid in explanations. First, let's go through the attack equation. We take the base stat of Totodile, which is 65, and add an IV from the set of 0 to 15 inclusive, meaning there are 16 unique results. We multiply that result by 2 and then add the square root of the stat experience divided by 4, but since Totodile has never won a battle, this value is 0. If we were using Pokemon Showdown's damage calculator, the stat experience value would be 65,535, so you can see why that'd make a huge difference. Back to the equation, we then multiply all of that by Totodile's level, divide by 100 and add 5. The defense stat calculation for Hoppip follows the same formula, this time using Hoppip's base defense and level. The main difference with the defense calculation is the inclusion of stage multipliers that result from Totodile's use of Leer. Depending on how many times it's used, Hoppip's defense is multiplied by a different fraction in the set. As you might notice in the original equation, stat modifiers are nowhere to be found, but after 3 hours of testing and research, I know that they go here. Since we're talking about stats, let's hop over to Hoppip's health calculator. Fuck that joke. It's almost exactly the same as the other statistic calculations, but instead of adding 5 at the end, we add Hoppip's level plus 10. Now that we have all of the Pokemon stat calculations out of the way, we can now discuss the entire equation more easily. Starting from the left, we have 2 times Totodile's level, divided by 5 plus 2. Simple enough. We then multiply that by the power of Scratch, which is 40. Then we multiply by Totodile's attack and divide by Hoppip's defense stat after stage multipliers have been applied. Now we can divide all the work we've done so far by 50 and add 2. Finally, we arrive at this strange looking section with a bunch of multiplications. Most of these are collectively known as modifiers. Some of these don't matter to us for this scenario, namely targets, weather, badge, same type attack bonus, type, burn, and other. The modifiers that do matter are critical and random. Critical, as you would suspect, is whether or not the attack is a critical hit, and because I intend to use save states to make sure every attack is a critical hit, the damage will always be multiplied by 2. Random is the part of the equation that leads to the 39 different damage values I discussed earlier. First, there is a multiplication by a randomly generated integer between 217 and 255 inclusive, followed by a division by 255. When that random number is 255, we effectively multiply by 1, which results in the perfect critical hit. After the modifiers have been applied, the final part of the equation is a multiplication of the calculated damage value by the maximum number of turns Scratch can be used before the struggle one-shot ends the match. This value is determined by the number of times Totodile uses Leer. If Leer is used 6 times, there are only 34 turns available, whereas using it less will allow 35 turns to use Scratch. Finally, on the right side of the greater than or equal sign is the calculation for Hoppip's health, which we already discussed. That's the entire equation. Now that you know how the equation works, or pussied out and skip to this point, the most logical thing to do first is to see if the best case scenario will result in a defeated Hoppip. First, let's take out all the unnecessary components like EVs and extra modifiers. Next, let's assume that Totodile has the maximum of 15 attack IVs, making his resulting attack stat 13. Let's also assume I run into the weakest Hoppip with 0 defense IVs and 0 HP IVs, resulting in a defense of 85 and a total HP of 180. Notice how Totodile's max attack stat is 2 points lower than what is predicted by Pokemon Showdown's damage calculator, and Hoppip's defense is 9 points higher than the minimum reported by Bulbapedia. Having run this equation many times, I already know that using Leer 5 times instead of 6 is the best strategy, so let's set the stage modifier and the number of turns to the correct values. The equation is much smaller now, so we can line it up all in traditional fashion. Now, before we go any further, we need to talk about titties. No, not that kind of titties, you disgusting weebs. I'm talking about truncated integer division. The DIES is what happens to my happiness every time I think about this project. Truncated integer division means that after each division operation, the decimals of the result are sliced off. Basically, this just means everything is rounded down to the nearest whole number. Though it's called truncated integer division, every step of this equation should be rounded down if it has a decimal. The only non-integer used in the entire equation is the stage multiplier fraction that is multiplied with the defense, but the result is still rounded down. Thankfully, there are no operations that result in a non-integer in the attack, defense, or HP calculation formulas, so these were all okay to simplify along with some other parts of this equation. The first titty we have to deal with is the multiplication of the stage multiplier and the defense. Using the -5 stage multiplier, titties doesn't make that much of a difference here, nor when we divide by the new defense. The next division is where titties makes a huge difference. If we weren't using titties at all, after we divided by 50, we would get about 1.75, and taking that through the rest of the equation would get us about 7.5 as the damage output for one turn. Assuming we round down at the end, 7 times 35 equals 245, which is definitely in the range needed to defeat level 100 Hoppips at minimum defense. Because we have to truncate, the result of this entire section is 1, which in the end results in 6 damage for a single turn or 210 damage after 35 turns. It's less of a window for error, but it's still enough to bring down a weak Hoppip. And would you look at that, Totodile can beat—
How could you be so fucking stupid? I know. You're a dumb fuck! A dumb fuck!
Imagine thinking it was that easy. You fucking idiots actually trusted Bulbapedia's formulas? Big fucking lammo. I don't trust anything anymore. Pokemon Showdown's damage calculator? Broken. Bulbapedia? Fake news. This equation is wrong because it's based off a pile of lies. Okay, maybe that's an exaggeration, but the damage formula on Bulbapedia is incorrect for Generation 2. But Andy, why would you spend this much time telling me lies? Well, I didn't find this out until after 35 hours of research and testing, so don't start with me. It took me and my genius friend Chance another 10 hours to research, test, and go through the data mined code to deduce the real formula. Thankfully, it's about the same as the equation I've been obsessed with so far, and most of the stuff I've already talked about still applies, so I didn't waste your time. Let me take you through the journey I had trying to find the real damage formula. Having finally finished the formula that we now know is incorrect, I set out again to do some more in-game testing. I had resolved the issue of not knowing what a Hoppip stats were by making a save in the battle, catching the Hoppip, and then checking to see if the stats were acceptable. Surprisingly, the 6th Hoppip I found had near best case scenario stats, so I was able to reload the save to when I was battling it and use it for testing. I never hit anything close to 6 damage. Panicking, I went to Reddit for advice, but no one gives a shit about Generation 2 level 100 Hoppip mathematics. However, out of the 10 responses I got, there was one user who mentioned that the original equation was probably data mined from Generation 5. Armed with this newfound knowledge, I went searching for other sources. On the Azure Heights website, there was a different damage formula, this time for Generation 1. The most important difference of this formula is that the critical hit multiplier was applied to the Pokemon's level instead of as a modifier. This almost made the equation line up with the test results I got, but here's the caveat. In this formula, critical hits override stage multipliers, disabling their application. This couldn't be true for Generation 2 since testing had shown that Leer definitely had an effect. Finally, after 5 hours of working and reworking equations with my friend Chance, I came across the battle mechanics page on the Cave of Butterflies website. This page said, quote, "In the 2nd generation, all stat modifiers were ignored for a critical hit if and only if the attacker's offensive stat stage was less than the target's defensive stat stage. Because my offensive stat stage is always 0, and the Hoppip's defensive stat stage ranges from -6 to 0, this meant that critical hits would always take into account stage multipliers for this battle. This was later confirmed when Chance found a data mining project for Pokemon Crystal and saw that the code matched our theory. So, now that we have the real equation, we can again simplify and solve for the best case scenario. After all of the calculations, we can conclude that the highest damage possible in a single turn is 4, which, multiplying by 35, is 140, far below the minimum Hoppip HP of 180. Even if you were to catch 5 Hoot Hoots, which have the highest HP in this area at their original levels, and use them as sacrifices against Hoppip's struggle attacks in the hopes of dealing enough recoil damage to make up for the leftover health, they would only provide 20 damage total, leaving Hoppip with 20 health before it one-shots your last Pokemon. Sadly, it is impossible to beat a level 100 wild Hoppip that retains the moves it would normally have when encountered at its intended level before the Trainer Joey battle with the level 5 starter Pokemon obtained from Professor Elm that has not won a single battle in Pokemon Crystal. Now, considering that this strategy was made to beat Pokemon Crystal with every Pokemon at level 100 except my own, is that challenge impossible too? Well, right now I'm dunking on Falkner after getting the first batch, so it's looking pretty optimistic. I'm not going to tell you how I did it in this video, but I'd love to see your guesses at how I got past the beginning of this game. Make sure you share this video so my channel can grow, and come hang out at some of my streams, which, if you're watching this video close to when it's released, I'm still working on the level 100 challenge. Thanks to Brad for creating the ROM hacks and to Chance for helping me out with all of the math and research of this project. And as always, thank you for watching.